Hey everyone, Jeremy Smith here with Rethink 315, and I am shooting again from my basement. So, disclaimer, if you hear a ruckus upstairs that sounds like a herd of elephants wrestling over peanuts, that's my squad. So please be patient. I'm trying to get through this in one take, and I'm not going to stop for loud noises. Anyway, in my last video, I talked about my 15 years in youth ministry and my 10 years leading an apologetics ministry for college-bound Christian teens. I said in the last video that now more than ever, I'm convinced that incorporating Christian apologetics into evangelism, discipleship, and just about everything we Christians do is critical. I mentioned that in my circle of influence, incorporating apologetics into youth ministry, while that may have been innovative 10, 15 years ago, these days, more and more churches and ministries are doubling down on apologetics, resources as well as events. And so I do think it's worth mentioning that the fact that more churches and ministries in our city are interested in the study and practice of apologetics is overall, I think it's a very positive trend. As a matter of fact, I'm flattered that so many of you have locked arms with me over the years, and you've test driven new ideas and you've rolled out new programs, and I was glad to be a part of that. However, as much as I love to see my friends equipping their people, I'm equally convinced that we would all benefit by pressing pause and rethinking the way we define Christian apologetics and rethinking the way we practice Christian apologetics, especially as it relates to training and equipping young people. Here's why. I mentioned that I've been speaking at lots of different churches and events over the years. I've talked to lots of people. More importantly, I've been listening. Following the example of one of my mentors, who's also on the Rethink 315 advisory board, I'll often ask audiences to tell me what immediately comes to mind when they think of Christian apologetics. What key words, what topics come to mind? I just think of it as an informal poll, and more often than not, we end up with a pretty narrow and you could say predictable list of words and topics. As a matter of fact, some of you, just over the last couple of days, you guys participated in my informal Facebook poll. And by the way, thanks for chiming in. Thanks for helping me prep for this talk. So when I tally these answers, the key words that come up the most are debating, arguing, and defending. And by the way, that's true of every audience, large or small, in person or online. It's true of lay people, pastors, parents, educators, apologists, and everyone in between. Most of the time, debating, arguing, and defending are the words that come up. And when I ask about the key topics that come to mind when people hear the word apologetics, the answers are definitely more varied, but it's still somewhat narrow, somewhat predictable. In a general audience, the apologetics topics that come up the most are usually science or the Bible or our faith, our Christian faith specifically. And it's probably worth noting, if I'm speaking to a more youth-oriented group, those answers, those topics might be more focused on biblical inerrancy or arguments against evolution, but these still fall under the above categories. Now, if I'm speaking to an audience of apologists, there are certainly more technical and a larger list of topics that people mention, but it's still somewhat predictable. When I talk with apologists and I ask them to, throw out some topics that they associate with apologetics, I'll usually hear the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the moral argument, arguments for the reliability of the Bible, arguments for the resurrection of Jesus, the problem of evil and suffering, etc., etc. So definitely more categories and certainly more technical topics, but still somewhat predictable. And I've conducted a lot of these informal polls, and while none of them have been like a controlled study or a formal statistical analysis, I've seen some trends, and these are the terms, these are the topics that I hear the most. And while most of these terms and topics definitely they fit neatly under the umbrella of Christian apologetics, I really want students, pastors, parents, educators, I want everyone to know that there's room for a lot more. And this is important because unless you're the type that is inclined towards argumentation and debate, and unless you're disciplined or motivated enough to study and master a list of very technical topics, you might feel that apologetics is not for you. It's not for your church. It's not for your ministry. So let's take a few minutes to unpack and maybe rethink the definition of Christian apologetics. And let's start with 1 Peter 3:15 and the Greek word apologia. So as a lot of you know, we get this word apologetics from the Greek word apologia, and it's most often translated to mean a verbal defense. This word apologia is used 8 times in the New Testament, but I would argue that 1 Peter 3:15 is the verse most commonly associated with it. So let's read 1 Peter 3:15. What does it say? It says, "In your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense and apologia to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do this with gentleness and respect." And I'm reading from the ESV here. And so this is, and a lot of you know this is the classic apologetics proof text. If you ever find yourself in the parking lot of an apologetics conference, this is the verse on everyone's bumper stickers. Again, this word apologia is usually translated to mean a verbal defense. Okay, so I'm not a language expert, but this seems to be a correct and fair translation. However, the legal tone and the courtroom connotations sometimes overshadow the broader meaning, the argumentative undercurrent. This can be a real turnoff, or at least a bit of a stumbling block to those of us who aren't lawyers or aren't exactly comfortable turning everyday conversations into legal hearings or debates. Jesus doesn't need an attorney. You've heard people say that. Many of you said that. This is actually a really common objection to the study of and the practice of apologetics, and I get it, and I mostly agree. So, what is an apologia if not a verbal defense? Well, it's not less than a defense, but it can and it should be more. More broadly, this word apologia can be understood to mean a reasonable reply, or a thoughtful response, or just a word back, or more simply, an explanation or an answer to those that ask us questions. So remember this, and this is really important. Although maybe there were some lawyers and debaters that were included in Peter's intended audience, 1 Peter 3:15 specifically, and 1 Peter generally, was not written primarily to the law firms and the speech and debate teams dispersed throughout all these Roman provinces in Asia Minor. Not at all. But these technical, scientific, and philosophical arguments, they can and should be verbally defended. The author of First Peter probably wasn't thinking about the Kalam cosmological argument when he said to always be ready to make an apologia for the hope that's in you. As a matter of fact, in that context of First Peter, not only were devout Jewish groups pressing on Christian converts to give an answer, to give an apologia for this strange new hope that they had, but Roman authorities were too. Christians were thought to be atheists for rejecting the Roman gods. They were thought to be cannibals for eating Jesus' body and drinking his blood. They were thought to be incestuous for making statements like, "I love you, brother," or "I love you, sister." A first century Christian wouldn't be answering a lot of the technical topics that we associate with apologetics. A first century Christian, they would be responding to first century questions asked in a first century context. And by the way, they would be doing all of this under first century persecution, but that's a side note. Anyway, those of you watching this, you're probably not used to giving an apologia, or you're not often required to give an apologia against these charges of cannibalism or incest. That might even seem a little silly to you. Well, it wasn't silly to the readers of Peter's letter. Most of you watching this probably aren't often required to give an apologia to defend the Kalam cosmological argument, for example. Maybe that also seems a little silly to you. But it's not silly to a lot of contemporary Christian philosophers who were asked to give an apologia for their beliefs. And so here's the first of 3 points that I hope to make. Defending against charges of cannibalism is not commonly associated with Christian apologetics because those questions just aren't common in our cultural context. Defending against the cosmological argument is commonly associated with apologetics, but it's not because this question is exactly common in our cultural context. I think this is associated with apologetics because it's a relatively common question asked in a very specific cultural context by certain kinds of people. And it just so happens that a lot of really talented Christians in that context are answering those questions, and they're writing a lot of books, and they're engaging in a lot of public debates. And many of us in apologetic circles, we buy those books in hopes that we might be better apologists. And maybe we even model our ministries after theirs in hopes that we might be better apologists. Is this a bad thing? Not necessarily, but it's like studying computer coding when you work in human resources. Is it helpful to have some coding and some IT knowledge? Possibly, maybe. But will that coding knowledge address the HR questions you will be answering in your context from your people? Probably not. Again, while apologetics is not less than the formal, legal, verbal defense of a handful of very technical, philosophical, scientific, historical topics, etc., it's so much more than that. To paraphrase one of our advisory board members, redefining apologetics for a broader audience is important, but it's an exercise in addition, not subtraction. We're hoping to expand on the popular definition, not erase it. So I hope you hear that from us. And just to maybe bring this back down to earth, just a few days ago, I was talking with a friend and possible supporter of the ministry, and he mentioned to me that he's in this book study with a group of other Christians, and they recently decided to dive into apologetics. So I won't name the author of the book, but and I won't name the book, but my friend confessed to me that it was all very technical, and that he was having a bit of a hard time seeing how these apologetics topics and these arguments fit into his everyday ministry with everyday people. For the most part, he's just not ministering to or witnessing to attorneys and scientists and philosophers. So understandably, it was difficult for him to see the book's content as being useful in his mission field. And he certainly didn't, see himself as an aspiring apologist. That's a really common objection. I think that's fair and reasonable pushback, especially if we're defining apologetics in a very narrow way. But we want to expand our definition. So let me attempt to flip a switch and to turn on a light bulb for you. This the same way that someone did for me over 5, maybe 6 years ago, and the same way that I think I did for my friend. So there's this guy, my friend that I'm talking about, has a very deep, very intimate relationship with Jesus, and as an extension, he has a very intense prayer life. After he said he didn't really see apologetics fitting into his personal ministry, and he didn't really see himself as an apologist, I looked him right in the eyes, and I asked him this question. I said, "Why do you pray? And what makes it so important to you?" Without hesitation, he answered by saying that more than anything else, the reason he prays so much is that it strengthens his personal relationship with God. And I said, "Thanks for answering my question. I agree." And then I congratulated him for entering into this wonderful world of Christian apologetics. And I explained to him that he is now an official, card-carrying, certified Christian apologist. He offered me an apologia. He offered a word back, a response, an answer. You could say a defense. And this, by definition, makes him an apologist. So here's my second point. The moment we Christians open our mouths to respond to questions about our faith, or Jesus, or ethics, or the Bible, or church, or prayer, or whatever, we are offering an apologia, and we are engaging in Christian apologetics. And I would add to that whenever our answers are pointing people towards a creator, or towards Jesus, or towards their need for rescue, or for a savior, or towards the problem of sin, or even just imperfection, or biblical principles, or whatever it is, even if we're not explicitly using these terms or offering up Bible addresses, we're still engaging in Christian apologetics. And Acts 17 is a great example of this. So look, if you're a philosopher answering questions from other philosophers, you'll likely find yourself offering a philosophically loaded apologia to the questions coming at you. But if you're a historian, same thing, different questions, but you might be offering historically loaded answers. If you're a scientist, same thing. Oh, and just a quick side note to you philosophers watching, before you email me, look, I know virtually everything that we ponder falls under the category of philosophy. Just let it slide for the sake of this lesson. Anyway, to everyone else, knowing who you are, knowing how you're wired, knowing where you're placed, and the questions that your people are asking you, so important. You've heard the saying that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If all you have is a scientific, if all you have is a scientific argument, maybe You'll be tempted to treat every person you meet like a scientist. Maybe you'll be tempted to force non-scientific people into scientific discussions, and maybe you'll even call it apologetics, and maybe you'll call it evangelism. But is it? And this is why the team and I believe that we really need to rethink how we define Christian apologetics. We need to rethink how we practice Christian apologetics, as I said, especially with our young people. And this is just so important because my friend's view of apologetics and my friend's difficulty seeing himself as an apologist, it's not rare. A lot of you felt the same way just a few minutes ago. Talking about my informal polls, sometimes in addition to or as a follow-up to asking people about apologetics, I might ask people in the room to tell me, how many of them consider themselves to be Christian apologists. And unless I'm speaking to a room full of apologists, very few hands go up. Why is this? Because a very large percentage of everyday Christians just aren't interested in studying, in arguing and defending a narrow list of technical topics. And they're not interested in doing this like lawyers in a courtroom, or like scientists in a lab, or like debaters on a stage. And that's okay. So I'll knock on the side door with them, like I did with my friend, and I'll ask how many people have ever been asked a question about some aspect of their faith by a non-Christian or a curious Christian or a hurting Christian. I'm asking you too. How many of you have been asked questions? And then how many of you actually bothered to open your mouth or type out a response or an answer or a word back? And of course, nearly everybody's hand goes up. And so congratulations. We're all apologists. And so my third and final point, in light of what I just said, and more importantly, in light of 1 Peter 3:15 specifically, I think the questions we should be asking are not, should we do apologetics, and if so, who are the apologists? I really think the questions we should be asking are, am I honoring Christ the Lord as holy? Am I living a life that's as worthy of questions? What exactly is my hope in? What does it look like, or what does it sound like for me to love my neighbor enough to answer their questions, to offer a response, to offer a word back, and to do it in a manner that's both pleasing to the Holy Spirit, but also biblically faithful, and also reasonable, and you could say logical, but also in a way that makes sense to the people I'm talking with. And then finally, Peter would ask the question, what does this look and sound like to do it with gentleness and respect? And so this is how we define Christian apologetics. This is how we also identify Christian apologists here at Rethink 315. And this, more than anything else, informs our mission, our message, and our methods. So before I wrap up, as a short disclaimer, please don't hear what I'm not saying. In case you missed it, I don't want to erase our current definitions of apologetics. I don't want to minimize the categories. I just want to add. I want to add to them. As some of my friends watching, that you guys actually are lawyers. Some of you are real scientists, and you're doing science in secular spaces. Some of you are philosophers, some are theologians and Bible scholars, and some of you are actually skilled debaters. To you, listen, we need you. We want you. I want you to continue the important work you're doing to share Jesus in your context to your people. But for the rest of us, we need to understand our people, and we need to understand our context and the questions that we're being asked. And so our hope at Rethink 315 is that we can help churches and schools and ministries to make room under their apologetics umbrella for not less, but for more topics, more answers, and most importantly, more people. In every cultural moment, loving your neighbor generally, and I would argue evangelism and discipleship specifically, it always includes answering questions. And you already knew that. And so the message of Rethink 315 is that while it's okay to be an attorney or a scientist or a skilled debater or an acclaimed academic, you don't have to be to offer an apologia to the people you care about. In my next video, I want to dig down a little bit deeper into the types of topics usually associated with apologetics. And I want to contrast those with the types of questions that I'm actually hearing from non-Christians and also Christians. More importantly, I want to talk about the different types of questions that I've heard at various stages in my history of ministering to young people. So 15-year history. If you stuck with me this long, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button and be sure to like Rethink 315 on Facebook and follow Rethink 315 on Instagram. And please, if you haven't already, visit rethink315.org to get a read on our purpose, on our people, and also some of the programs that we hope to launch in the months to come. And then finally, if you're a student, if you're an adult, and you're interested in learning more about what we're doing here, or if you're interested in perhaps even investing in this, I think, very unique ministry, please, if you know me, just reach out to me personally. Text, email, whatever, call. And if you don't know me very well, go ahead and use the contact information on the site. Let's sit down, Zoom or in person, and let's talk. Take care, everyone. And I will see you, I hope, in the next video.